reception there starting at 7. It's walking distance from here. Before we start the final panel, and I'll let you guys I wanted to make an announcement that for anyone here doing the College Art Association next week, assuming there's not another blizzard, get there is a book launch reception sponsored by the Roski School on Friday, the 5th of February in the conference hotel, midday from 12:30 to 2, and this is in honor of a book I co-edited with Aaron Silver called Otherwise, Imagining Queer Feminist Art History. So everybody's welcome. Be there. As well, we're also celebrating the hire of Nadia Bustamante at Roski. She has a show with Marcos Cullen Nazario at the Transformer Gallery in Washington, which opens the night before, on February 4th, from 6 to 9 p.m. So anyone who's going to be in Washington again, please come to that opening. And now I'm happy to introduce Jack Halberstam and Rebecca Schneider to guide us through the last panel.
All right. Thank you, Amelia. Thanks to everybody who's been involved in putting on this great event. I'm really happy to be here. And Rebecca and I are going to sort of tag team this final panel. And no.
It's too dark.
It's too dark. You know, this time of night, everyone's going to be not off in a minute. I may. Yeah, that could be anything. That's my point. Okay. Okay, I mean, I think we could have more light on the audience, but that's okay. I think that maybe the right thing to do at this time of day or time of the evening is to try to be a little bit provocative and take issue with some of the things that have been said, rather than just, round up. So I'm going to begin with 5 proposals that I think cut against some of the ways in which we've talked about liveness and archiving so far, and offer, I'm not going to simply oppose what's being said. I want to offer a different perspective on the relationship between liveness, queerness, and archiving. And then at the end of it, we can kind of make sense of the different ways in which people have discussed all of these things. And some of the archive that I'm going to use for my presentation today will be what gets called auto-destructive art. And we have seen a lot of auto-destructive art already over the last 2 days. So I'm not making any particular claim about the originality of this particular genre or about its specificity. There are lots and lots of things, including the Kipper kids. They could easily fall into auto-destructive art. Lots of Ron Apey's work falls under the heading of auto-destructive art. But auto-destructive art also was a particular movement in the 60s and then has resurfaced in queer context. And I think it tells us something really, really different about the relationship between liveness, death, and archives than some of the ways in which we've talked about those things so far. So let me give you 5 proposals to begin. One, I want to talk about what I would call the violence of the archives. And you got a little sense of this when Ron Apey was reminding us that Jack Smith did not want his archive to be saved. And the irony then of it ending up, as he said, in a blue chip gallery is important to acknowledge. So when we save things that want to be lost, okay, think about that. There are archives that actually want to be lost. What kind of act of reclamation is that? Is it potentially an act of violence against that archive that wants to disappear and wants to, we could even say, be complete, and be complete by being over? So is there a kind of fetishization of presence? Obviously there is. The very concept of archive fetishizes presence, but the concept of archive always also draws attention to what is not there. And then very often we respond by saying, well, that's true, some things aren't in the archive, how can we recover those things too? But what if there are some forms of materiality that do not want to be preserved. What would that look like? What would that be? And what should our relationship to that look like? So one of the problems with archiving is that it often casts the archivist as a heroic savior, somebody who is redeeming material that would otherwise be lost. And therefore, some of the emphasis falls upon the archivist, and often against the very wishes of the artist. So that the relationship between the archivist and the artist I'll speak about in a moment. But we could think about Jose Munoz's transformative work on Fred Harco in that beautiful chapter in Cruising Utopia, where he goes back to Fred Harco's final leap out of a window of his friend's apartment, not to save Harco, but to save the ephemeral nature of that gesture. Okay, and he famously invokes Andy Warhol, saying that he would have taped it, that he wished he could have been there to tape it. But Munoz's point was that he wasn't there, no one did tape it, it was not captured, and that there was something about this leap that wanted to be elusive, right? And that we actually have to acknowledge that, deal with that, and think about what it means to inherit that gesture, as opposed to the tidy gesture of something that arrives to us properly archived, labeled, and so on, okay? And Jack Smith would be the other example, as I said. The relationships then sometimes between artists and archivists can be, extremely tense, because an archive, as much as it can be the preservation of something, as many people have said, can also be the appropriation of something. And think of Joe Spence's work, where what she was really documenting in her artwork about her, basically her slow decline to breast cancer, was not what was there, i.e. the healthy breast, but what was missing. The breast that is no longer a breast. Is this any longer her property? So that amazing question, is this the property of Joe Spence, is kind of the question, as Castle suggested, that the artist is constantly asking the archivist, is this my property? Is this your property? Is any of this property at all? Does the archive presuppose property? Does it presume that artwork is property? And does it therefore collude in the art market? What if the resistance to the art market is the resistance to seeing the work as property in the first place, intellectual property or whatever kind? So we could say that the relationships between artists and archivists are very often not sites of collaboration, but deep sites of miscommunication. And that should be part of the way in which we think about liveness and archiving. And then Uli suggested to us that there are works that attempt to inhabit fugitivity, that want to, as he put it, elude intellectual capture. So what if the point of performance was, in fact, to stage fugitivity itself? And can we live with that? Can we stay with that? Can we think about what it would be to perform fugitivity? To perform fugitivity, in some sense, is to perform something that cannot be put in an archive. The minute it's in the archive, it is no longer fugitive. Okay, so I would love to talk about it. Finally, in relationship to that point, I kind of want to push back a little bit on something Jennifer said, where she said, well, we're getting away from sex again. And we're actually never getting away from sex. In fact, so much of contemporary performance is sex in some other form. And we should remember that sex often wants to be archival. Okay? Reproductive sex is the desire for a fleshly archive of an act. Isn't it? I mean, so what if queer sex, in fact, was anti-archive? Could we say that if you want sex in the archive, it's going to have to come in the form of something that's destroyed, or something that disappears, or something that cannot appear, or something that will refuse to reappear in the form of the fleshly? And here you could think about the Bassani idea of self-shattering as a queer relationship to sex. Okay, and yes, Judy, that's your painting. This is a painting by Judy Bamber of her mother, and that I think captures really beautifully the mixed legacy of generational transmission and somebody spoke earlier in the day about how important it is for the archive to stand as a record of the generation that came before. And that sounds so right, but it might in fact be exactly what's wrong with the archive. Because to leave a legacy is also to impose a burden on people who come next. And is to say, you know, you must hold on to my legacy, you must remember me. Is that a burden? Does that arrive to younger people in the form of a burden, or what used to be called anxiety of influence? So now I have to live up to this, or I have to be this, or I have to reproduce this. Forgetting is underrated, in my opinion, and I've written in many places about the importance, in fact, of forgetting in order for there to be anything like newness, which is a kind of Nietzschean relationship to temporality and saving. Does generational transmission do nothing more than create an obligation that weighs heavily upon a younger generation who either feel that there's nothing left to say, there's nothing new to do, or that their obligation is to hold on to the works of people who came before? You know, what if we actually relieved young people of their generational debt and said, you know, forget us. What is it that you want to say? So I want to, again, these are sort of counterintuitive proposals, and I may or may not even in the end stand behind them, but I want to at least put them out there in order to break up some of what feels like repetition of some cliches around liveness and archiving that we would do well to stay clear of. In terms of asking a very Rebecca Schneider question, which would be what remains of performance, again, I want to suggest that performance isn't simply the performer, okay? And I think Rebecca will talk about this too. The performance is also something that is created in that moment of performance, and it might also be the object with which the performer interacts. And lots of things don't want to stay, okay? So could we see performance, could we rethink performance here as a kind of anti-memorial action? And as potentially in this era of, you know, of what we call the Anthropocene, in this moment when we are leaving such terrible scars on the earth, and that is our legacy, that we leave complete ruination. Our generation that is so committed to long life, to extended life, right? What if that is the damaging principle, is extension, right? What if we thought of art and performance like a hiker in the wilderness? You know, leave with what you brought in. Whatever you came with, take it with you. Get it out of here. Do not keep leaving little monuments, little piles of shit to say that you were here, right? Get rid of it. What if that's the proper end for art? And that's something that performance is actually trying to tell us, like end it, finish, complete, leave, right? But what if those would be the responses that we saw, and that in that sense we would elude the financialization of the art market that absolutely depends upon this financial capture of an object. And so many artists have to distort what they're doing in order to have an object to sell at the end. What if we just paid artists instead of requiring them to produce objects that the market recognizes as valuable? So the whole understanding of value needs to shift away from the object and maybe towards the practice of art. And there are lots of different ways in which we could easily distribute the money that goes into the art market between and amongst artists. I think that the archive, in fact, is absolutely working hand in hand with an art market and allows for the financialization of everything. Finally, in relationship to this, and then I think that I will just end with a few examples of auto-destructive art that I think form these principles. I feel that we have not discussed race at this conference in any way, shape, or form, and I think that it's an important to remember how different the difference that blackness makes to what we call performance. And here I'm thinking about a great new book by Yuri Macmillan called Embodied Avatars, in which he thinks about the way in which black people have been situated back through slavery as both subjects and objects, right? And in that sense, he traces a long lineage of performance history going back to slavery, within which black artists perform objecthood and think about being in relationship to a renewed or different relationship between the subject and the object. And there are a few examples of this. You know, Howardina Pindell is one of these avatars that he spends a lot of time on, reminding us that she worked in MoMA as an administrator without ever getting recognition for the actual artwork that she was producing, right? So you have these images of people of color sort of toiling behind the scenes, and their art is not recognizable according to the categories that the museum is producing, even as they work in the museum backstage or whatever. And there's tons of examples of black artists who literally produce and perform objecthood, where they're merging that relationship between the performance and the thing performed. And so you could think of William Popel, his crawls. Like, it's not he is crawling, it's a crawl, right? That he is the place where the action and the being are merged. And being, then, is a topic for Adrian Piper's Mythic Being series. Again, it's changing, almost grammatically, the relationship between subject, object, and action. And these almost grammatical relations, rules of meaning-making, are transformed through the process of black art production. So I would want to keep these proposals, these 5 proposals in mind, while discussing the relationship between liveness, the dead, and performance. Now, in my, I have a chapter on auto-destructive art. I'm going to be careful about time here and just do 5 more minutes. There's a chapter in my book on wildness on auto-destructive art as a kind of wild relationship to the archive that seeks an anti-sentimental relationship to collection. Okay, an anti-sentimental relationship to collection. And here I really credit the original work of Gustav Metzger in naming this particular set of gestures as auto-destructive art. And Metzger is an interesting character. He was a refugee from the war, a child refugee, and instead of investing in a sort of sentimental narrative of the child, or of evacuation, or of salvation, of escape, instead he turned his art practice into one in which obliteration is the goal. And this, you know, you end up then with this violent art where the whole point is to leave no trace. And this, you know, relates back to what I was saying earlier. But these works of his are literally where you take the canvas and you spray acid on it to completely eliminate anything that might be left for the market, or for anyone, you know. And so it's interesting, people are trying desperately to create these Gustav Metzger retrospectives now, and it's like, then you go to them and you're like, I mean, I don't, you know, this, what's the pile of bricks, a little bit of ripped canvas, but that, you know, that's the point. It resists the museumization of what is left or what is not left. And I think that rather than say his legacy in his to these objects, his legacy is in this principle that some art, potentially what we call performance, should self-destruct, and that it should be a kind of tidier principle. And that's just the anti-sentimentalization piece. His legacy is much more gestural than it is to any objects. So Pete Townsend's guitar smashing is often credited to Metzger. You can think of entire movements of punk, these punk gestures of like, I don't want to save anything, no future, you know, let's just destroy passers-by, to quote the Sex Pistols. That's the set of gestures that Metzger understood to be part of his legacy from World War II. That in many ways, it was the gesture of rescue, he suggests, that has coercion built into it. And he wants to keep calling attention to the politics of elimination and extinction that did not end with World War II, that did not end with the Holocaust, but in fact have been folded into neoliberal sentimentalism. That's how I read that work. We won't go into all of this, aesthetic obliteration. You can find it in the Viennese Actionismus group, but I think that they're super masculinist, like, and I felt a little bit like that about the Kipper kids, that is constantly like this performance of castration within which the phallus is nonetheless preserved. Like, you know, at least with the Viennese Actionismus, there was at least a performance of castration. There's a lot of displaying of the phallus, and not just that, but an anxious displaying of two phalluses in case one gets locked up. That twinning is often the anxiety behind the self-mutilation of the Viennese Actionismus. People who I think often flirted with fascism and as often produced it as opposed it. Much more, for me, much more elusive and evocative would be Bastian Adder's quiet, weird little performances, including his last performance, In Search of the Miraculous, where he set out across the Atlantic Ocean, and all that ever remained of that was half a boat. And that was literally his last performance. But these kind of beautiful little gestures that, yes, there is a performance archive of it because they were taped, but they're so banal. They're so kind of superficial, quiet, really like banality personified, that there's very little that you're left with, you could say, other than like a little splash or something. So I like these falls, reminding us of the frailty of the body. That again, the performance archive is teaching us how to be in a different relationship to death, rather than in a vibrant relationship to life. And I just want to conclude. I'm not going to go through all of these folks. Valley Exploit being the refusal of the masculinism of the Viennese Actionismus, but I want to end with the queer work, which for me takes the risk that a lot of the masculinist performances do not take, to precisely jump in the dark and set up in Cassell's work a beautifully, almost egalitarian relationship between the clay and the human body. What I think this is a deeply destructive, auto-destructive work. It isn't heroic. It isn't about the heroism of this gorgeously toned body in the end. It's about making the body in order to destroy it in performance. And Cassels does that over and over and over again. There's a building up in order to shatter, right? You make something in order to break it. And I feel that a lot of the other work falls short of the break, right? But the break is right there in the Cassels, such that the clay takes equal billing. The marks on the clay are really like as beautiful, as much in the aesthetic picture as the marks on the body. And at the end, it's both the clay and the body that have been destroyed, and they occupy a space together of destruction. I just want to end with Boy Child, who I think brings together some of the things that I've said about blackness, performativity, vulnerability, fragility, death, and dying. And Boy Child's work reaches back to the Japanese art form, the dark dance of Buto, despite the fact that Boy Child was never trained in Buto, but is now trying to go to Japan to work with the Buto master. And if you remember, the Buto was supposed to be a dance of death that called attention to the slow death that Japanese people were experiencing in the long aftermath of Hiroshima. So it wasn't just about we've survived the war. It wasn't a dance of survival. It was a dance of slow death that the Buto performers presumed they were all inhabiting, that they were all dying, and they performed these grotesque moves in response. Boy Child often occupies this like deeply apocalyptic space, and almost effortlessly is both something like a creature from the past and a creature from the future all at once. There's a kind of present tense, an extended present to the performance. And then I'll just read my little conclusion here. In the end, I think that Boy Child is saying that we don't know if we're going to survive this moment of decay that we inhabit, the decay of of the world, the decay of environmental ruin. We don't know whether it's going to end in rebirth, monstrous mutation, or something else entirely. What we do know is that this struggle, a struggle that we're privileged to witness, that he's talented enough to create, inhabit, and endure, is ongoing, desperate, and leads the way and teaches us how to inhabit oblivion.
That was terrific. I think Amelia, and thank you, Amelia, for everything. Sort of wanted us to fight, and argue. No, I know. I always put words in your mouth. I always don't like when I do that. Stop it. So I know you're live. Oh, I'm sorry for you. But now I see why, and I really do like to have. I do want to have a space. So I thought instead of just launching into my paper, which I actually do end up, I think, very close to some of the things you're saying, but to sort of ask you a question about, when I wrote Performing Remains, it's not a pro-archive book. In fact, the argument of that book is that actually performance, I'm Rebecca Schneider, that performance remains what remains differently. And this kind of question about destruction, I was trying to write against what I was thinking of as a thrall to loss. And a kind of fetishization of disappearance that was only left lost as an alternative. And also to really thinking about how performance for many cultures was a mode of remaining as against the archive, running under the archive so that, in other words, you think about your urban tradition, and you have a kind of, in a sense, a legislation against dance or against sort of modes of signifying that could, through performance, which is not in the archive, which wasn't given to the archive, wasn't allowed to the archive because the archive scripts performance as disappearing. That's an archives equation. The archive says performance has to disappear, we can't save it. So to go to the whole end of saying performance is just destruction, again, raises some sort of insecurities for me. I like instead to say the slash in your title, The Live Dead, to sort of think with the interval and the interstice. And so that we, in other words, the destruction sort of has to be there as this possibility. But to make a sort of claim like, never mind. I have these auto-destructive tendencies and brain synapses sometimes. So that was fantastic, and that's a question that I'll start with for you. But maybe instead of having you answer it now, I'll push on with my presentation, and we can kind of come back to these things. And this is the finishing live for what happened. I think the title is maybe better than the paper, and I'm going to try to, because I really liked how you sort of spoke extemporaneously, although you do have a paper, but I may have to dip in and out of it. So this paper, finishing live. Now is it the green one that I did? If live artworks are collected correctly, they can acquire a patina over time. Is it patina or patina? It's art. Patina. See, I'm not an artist. A patina over time. And this was a comment made live by Sabina Breitweiser in 2012, the then chief curator of media and performance art at MoMA in New York. And so this comment has been like a kind of a pebble in my shoe, really irritating me, because I really am like, what? What? A patina on performance? What could that possibly mean? So I looked up patina, and it really did mean what? Okay. I wasn't surprised by what it means. A thin coating or layer, an incrustation on the surface of metal or stone, usually as a result of an extended period of weathering or burial. Okay, so if you're curating correctly a piece of live art, it should end up being like it was buried. Okay. All right. Or two, a green or bluish green film produced naturally or artificially by oxidation on bronze. okay, I think this is in line with what people have thought about performance art. You have to film it in order for it to remain, so that makes sense. Patina would be some kind of film, some kind of photograph. A gloss or sheen, specifically that on wooden furniture produced by age and polishing. Okay, again, this is a question of finishing live. But that seems maybe in a little bit of tension with what liveness at least imagines itself to be. And finally, an acquired accretion of an abstract quality, a superficial impression or an appearance. I actually really like that, suggestion, the idea of liveness as an acquired accretion of artifice. That I like. Anyway, Breitweiser's comment on patina was made in the wake of another comment. She said, as an aside, when speaking of the work of Günter Bruce, quote, "I am about to acquire his actions." And now, I'm probably just slow. I mean, I know I am, because from my disciplinary perspective, as a scholar of theater and dance, statements on acquisitions and patina of the live just really still strike me as deeply strange, even though acquiring performance, right, is now common in museal practice, possessing, acquiring. And we were speaking a little bit about this. So I stumble over this. If Breitweiser was herself about to acquire Bruce's actions, I did really initially think when she said this that she was about to go and reenact, like paint herself with a white, in white with a black line and walk down the street. I really thought that for an instant. But then obviously clearly in the next flash of an instant I knew that's not what it was. She was going to acquire another's actions. That means acquiring the rights to disseminate the gestures of those actions, the choreography, to oversee the rights to re-perform the scores, etc. That is, she was about to acquire the right to not let others acquire the actions without permission. So it's like if an action, hi, Jack. Hi. Oh, now, so you acquired my action. But you also gave it back to me. But if, hi, Jack, and for a minute, what if she'd just been like, yeah, acquired your action? You don't, and then you're not going to let anybody else, you're not going to let me, there's a call and response sort of aspect to this, which is part of what I was talking about in Performance Remains, or Performing Remains, whatever, that was about performance can remain not in the original gesture, there is no such thing as an original gesture, but in the ricochet of that action in response or in another medium. This is what I call inter-in-animation, and I took this from Fred Moten, who is writing about the ricochet, how a piece of art will find itself in the next action, the next gesture, the next reiterative sort of response. So that is an idea of performance remaining as difference. And difference is not, not necessarily privileged by the archive. So anyway, her patina comment was made in regards to her opinion that proper stewardship of the rights to live art at moment's discretion would assure that a work of performance would acquire the erratic prestige of a masterwork. So when walking the patinated walk that Bruce's will walk in the future, the policeman pictured here would probably be a MoMA security guard with Bruce on a thin bronze leash, is what I was thinking. But the question is really what leads and what follows. What follows and what leads. So legislating or policing artworks for legitimacies of legacy may be the work of a curation machine that aims at the production of patinas, glosses, polishings, and finishes. But the question is an open one for me as to whether the live, which is a completely problematic moniker, is served by something that we imagine as its patina. Patents of the live may be closer to the point, and perhaps we should think of Breitweiser's statement along currents of the neoliberal privatizations of molecular liveness in the form of biocapitalization for the pharmaceutical/medical industrial complex. So thinking this might provoke us to extend the live or end the live, either one, in order to critique its co-optation by capital, something that maybe we can get to in conversation if there's time. Although this does put the museal thrall to live art in intimate quarters with neoliberal empirics. So in the longer version of this paper, I'm actually beginning to suspect that liveness is already patina, and I want to think that it's not about having, that liveness is already the patina, that liveness is itself the weathering, the distressing, because to weather or to distress are other words for patination. And so the aim might not be to provide a patina for the live, as Breitweiser suggested, but to provide the conditions for patination as an outbreak in ruination to thrive. What would that be like? Without object, just patination on the loose. Another way to say this might be to respect the weather, to go with it. It will take you anyway. You are already in it, which is a quote from Jack, to which we will return. So going with the weather, I'm going to veer off now. I thought, given the prompt from Amelia, I would talk about intervals. So intervals and undecidability. One interval might be the interval between live art and documentation, the moment of precarity when a live act becomes its own record, or when a record is acknowledged as live. But it seems that where there is live art, there are many intervals, not just those. So I want to think about intervals or the intervallic just a little bit here today. What Happened is Gertrude Stein's first play, 1913. This play and others like Ladies' Voices, 1916, affirmatively refuse the distinction between document and performance. Or better, the distinction is just not helpful or interesting to their project. Stein is up to something else. They are beginning again. What happened? Stein tried to make the play the thing that happened, rather than telling what happened, dramatizing what happened, narrating what happened, scripting what happened, or representing what happened. Being what happened was what happened in what happened. Quote, length, what is length when silence is so wonderful? What is the commonest exchange between more laughing and most? A long time, a very long time, there is no use in an obstacle that is original and has a source. It's 1946, no, sorry. Without use for origins, the script is the performance, is the play, is the document, is any of its instances, print, screen, performance, or reading. The document, the document, both are what happened in exchange among documents and performances. Let's take Stein's phrase, undecidable as a question, call, or answer, response. What is the commonest exchange between laughing and most? Okay, so that's Antonia Baer, and I think the score and the script are being played out here in an interesting way, also with call and response with the audience, and there's not necessarily a contagion, in a sense, of the call, response, the script, and the action. The interval, if there is an interval, as between a score or script and live enactment, or enactment and script, or print runs, etc., is, quote, windowful of 1,000 limits or plateaus, like the exchange among or the interval between laughing and more laughing. Intervals between instances of a thing, such as a laugh, in which a thing, a laugh, is exchanged with itself, laughter, might resemble moments when a thing, a performance, is exchanged with other instances of itself, a photograph, a document, or vice versa. The interval, which is not the live and not the dead, but the living dead, a medium of open possibility, is always on the verge of or in the midst of a not quite realized exchange. The interval between a call, say, and a response, an interval that occurs in an instance or takes 40,000 years, is always open without legislation. That's a cave law, and that's a Chauvet hand. How do our intervals take our notice? Are the space-offs, to remember Teresa de Loretas, of the, quote, in-between spaces, to quote Jack Halberstam, or the among spaces, which are not only in-between spaces, to quote Fred Moten, how are they themselves live? Or better, if liveness is overrated, are such in-between spaces the terrain of interinanimation, where the live and its twinned antonyms, the dead or the recorded, become undecidable in and as each other, where the live and the dead are their most wildly unbecoming. Intervals between and among are in fact very interesting to me these days, and I'm actually increasingly more interested in intervals than in the things in themselves, and in the performances, for instance, or the documents. I think, as Marx wrote explicitly, it is in the interval between production and consumption that the crisis in capitalism is pronounced. And pronounced, I think, as potential. Of course, capitalism thrives on that crisis, but only if dead labor is overcome into live labor again. But staying in the interval of dead labor, not reanimating in a reanimation machine that is capitalism, is something that the interval, I think, might provoke for us in thinking about so-called live art. Not resolving the interval is key. Again, to quote Jack, quote, failures, byways are all the spaces in between the superhighways of capital. Places that teem, she writes, with the, quote, remnants of alternative possibilities, the minor roadways, perhaps. So let's consider the intervals in and among Mona Hatoum's Roadworks, 1985, and her performance still, 1985, 1995. The image of the performance. The performance itself was live, consisting of the action of Hatoum walking barefoot for an hour with boots tied to her feet in Brighton area of London in 1985, and she did a series of 3 performances. There's a video and there are photographs, and descriptions and interpretations of this action exist in art historical texts, and some passers-by may still sort of recall the event in some ways. But how should we think of the material of intervals among the works and their documents? Are the intervals minor byways of iteration, or are they works, the work themselves? That is, how can we focus not on the performance on the one end, in some sort of, on one end, in some sort of medial, something, I don't know, my sentence is auto-self-destructing. This is going to be a very interesting, useful kind of concept. So if duration is material in live art, might not the intervals of duration between the acts or among iterations, among materials, shift our attention to the actual site of performance as in and among its own fissures, cracks, lesions, and legions? And how do we think of a work and its relationship, a work and its works, in relationship to their drag, their push, their multiple cross-temporal instances? So, of course, Roadworks contains a strikingly literalized interval. It's a kind of misstep or space between Hatoum's feet and her shoes. The impact of that interval, or those intervals, in fact, comprises much of the power of the piece, the literal drag of foot to boot, or the push of boot to foot, an incommensurability that puts us out of step with our habits and norms, the walking of the walk that usually transpires between boots and feet, or feet and boots. It's here undone, and yet walking remains. Are we attending this performance by attending to this document? At first, we may feel that we are out of step with a live performance. That is, we might insist that all we have here now is not the performance at all, but only its presence as a record. But with that attitude, we may be missing an important point. How can being out of step be out of step if out of step is integral to the piece? So its liveness, quote unquote, is more properly an inter-inanimacy that takes place across us. We are its boots on the ground, if you will, or it ours, dragged into misrecognition. I also think misrecognition is underrated. So maybe I should stop. I go on about a bunch of things about leading, following, but you know, we can come back to ideas that I have later in the paper if we want to. I think it might be a good place to stop. Later in the paper, I'm indebted to another essay by Jack in her work with Introduction to Moten and Harney's Undercommons, in which she says, as I cited, you know, you were always in it. In sort of, she's riffing on Harney's idea of call and response as kind of, again, an open interval of possibility that we are always already in. And so my question to you would be, if we're always in it, how can anything ever be destructive? Except maybe, you know. So, I mean, you know, what about sort of, yeah, so what about that? And I can return to some of these other things if it's useful.
All right. I mean, I think we have a lot of ideas out at this point. The proposals I made, the careful readings that Rebecca just gave us, the concept of the interval, the idea that the artwork is taking space in these in-between places as opposed to it being here or not here, and then this question of whether we ever are outside of any of the things that we're talking about. So I don't know if we want to, what do you think, Amelia? Do you think open it up or wake up? No. Why don't we see if there's, you know, any responses, comments, questions? Yeah, go for it.
I appreciate both of these conversations and sort of talk about the things in a certain way. In your argument, I'm really interested in how people can desire in materials in the archive, and sort of as if they have their own animus, as if they had a desire for their own destruction or not. And I was thinking about expression of identity and how sort of when I was a teenager, I felt like I had invented like a or something because I wasn't aware of the sort of history of people who had loved people of the same sex, et cetera, et cetera. And so I see that erasure as being addressed by, for example, I follow on Instagram bursary, post pictures from archives of like a couple like in the 20s or 30s, which I really had no awareness of. And so I see that as being really empowerment, and the erasure being sort of a way of erasing that history is like disempowerment. And so I'm wondering if you value the archive's possible desire to be erased over sort of the larger possibly societal good of empowering people who are better.
Yeah, thank you so much. What's your name?
Kate.
Kate. That's just a kind of beautiful question because it kind of gets right to what I think the stakes are of what I'm arguing, right? So if the conventional response to LGBT history has been, you know, hidden from history, let's recover and recuperate, right? What if there are either histories in the archive that you don't like, right? That's one thing that my work asks, like, okay, go into the archive, what did you find? Some gay Nazis and whatever. You don't want that, so you keep looking till you find the things that you want. So that would be one answer. But the other thing that you're proposing, which I think is really perfect and poignant, is what about histories that not only you didn't want to find, but did not want to be found? And I'll just give you an example of this from some other work that I looked at. There's an artist in Britain called Sarah Davidman, and she has a project called Can to be Destroyed. Can to be Destroyed. And it's, the title comes from a manila envelope she found in her mother's belongings when her mother died. It said, Can to be destroyed. And in the envelope were photographs and letters back and forth between her uncle and I. And the uncle, Ken, had lived a secret life as Hazel, as a trans woman. And he did not want these photographs found. Hazel, his wife, didn't want the photographs found. The mother didn't want the photographs found, and so she wrote on them, Ken to be destroyed. So Sarah, in her work, is trying to figure out what to do, Kate, with exactly something that comes to you through the archive as something that wants to be destroyed, and yet it found you, and you found it. And so the whole project, she then takes the photographs and she begins to destroy them. So they're both a record of destruction, but then there's still something. And she's kind of tortured about what that means. And when I presented this somewhere, I got an audience from a young trans person in the audience who was like, you know, you're destroying Hazel because you keep calling her Ken and referring to her as he. But that's the point about the record, you know, that it isn't obvious that this is either Ken or Hazel, and that it's Hazel. Hazel is the one that doesn't want to be found, in fact, right? So the question of recovery, the question of the way in which we tell these histories and these stories, and the way in which we want them clean, I think is confronted by both the material that Rebecca and I are both presenting, which offers these very muddied relationships, both across generations, but also between being lost and found, what's in the archive, what doesn't want to be in the archive, and then the way in which we tell these histories. So I feel like you kind of just got that, and I appreciate it.
I guess I have sort of an unfinished thought. I'm sort of trying to think about what you were mentioning about your sex being anti-archival action or something. But I can't help but think about like biology, like infections and diseases and how those things sort of are passed on, and in a way they index like our biology. And taking that a little bit further, I think about genetics and about like this idea of like transgenerational like problems being like deciphered into people's bodies. And I think about how like there's all of these biological crumbs that could be sort of like interpreted as being archival, and I almost want to tie that to like the physical archives as being like this sort of support, this sort of like way of like justifying our experiences or something, or like in addition to that, I think of something like CRISPR about like genetic mutations and being able to like rearrange DNA so that it doesn't have trauma or so that it doesn't have these characteristics. And when I think about those things, I think like, what are we trying to extinguish exactly? Like what are we, like with that example that you just gave about Hazel and all of that, I just think like, what is like, there's shame there, I'm sure. There's like, it's like layered and complicated, but I just question like, why destroy it or something?
Okay. I feel like that's almost a good question for you. Why destroy it? But I mean, what I hear you saying, and then maybe Rebecca would like to jump in, is, well, it's a bit flip to say sex is an anti-archive because any exchange between bodies leaves some kind of trace, or something is passed on, often unwanted. Something is passed on, right? So just the shift in one's DNA, the invasion of the supposedly, the way in which the body is contained speaks to a continual production of an archive. And I guess I want to sort of acknowledge that, but also wonder that, I guess I want to hold on to the idea of there being the possibility of sex as anti-archival. What if there was sex that just, really didn't want to be under the sign of production? But I feel like I'm not getting at it. And why do you want to destroy it? I mean, to go to your last question, I guess, why does one want to destroy? Because, again, to go back to my first point, there's something violent in creativity and production as well. It's just that we don't see it as such. Do you want to
I think one of the things about the archive
one of the things about the archive is that it sells loss, it sells destruction, as well as, that's its whole logic. The logic is all those other things that aren't in the archive will be destroyed. That's the archive's logic. So we have to get out from under our thrall to the archive, to that. That's, you know, that's not the only thing obviously the archives do. Maybe we should think about archives differently, or sort of shake up our fetishizations of loss, I think. This is what I was asking you in the beginning. To something more inter-muddy or indeterminate or not yet. I like leaving. I like the action of leaving better than maybe destroying. Because I also really feel that maybe this is, you know, I'm kind of really caught by the idea, Native American idea, that whatever happens in a place is always happening in a place. But what is it to try to listen to that? To hear histories that aren't, you know, in the archive, but nevertheless have not been destroyed. And if they want to leave, but they don't, but maybe they just want to go somewhere else.
Okay,
So,
but could there be a difference between being not in the archive and literally destroying so that something cannot be in the archive? You know, so there are things that are not in the
Yes,
archive
right.
because something else is in the archive, and then there is the act of literally destroying something precisely so that there is nothing left to go in the archive.
and I think that's where you were saying forgetting is underrated.
Right.
And you know, there are so many ways in which, you know, we would be well to work to forget. I agree. And there's more work that has to be done on that, so I'm glad you're doing it. Yes.
I want to sort of loop back to Jack's introduction of this as a series of provocations that kind of unsettle our thinking and stuff. Because, you know, like, I mean, I'm having so many thoughts about stuff that's been said here, because I think I disagree with almost half of everything that's been said, which I know was partly perhaps intentional. So, you know, one of the things I'm resisting is this really absolute language about archiving and the like. And I want to cite my wonderful colleague, Rob Hernandez, and his work on the queer Chicano archives, in particular, the archives of gay men who died quite young of AIDS, and artists in particular who never really reached into an age in which their art would have matured into something like a career, but in which they had an extensive practice of making objects, which then landed in the hands of friends and friends generally, and surviving partners who were in an antagonistic relationship with the family who retained all the property rights over the official archive, right? So you have these really tortured and complex histories of provenance and objects and people's relationships to objects. I remember the first time I saw him give a talk, you know, he's asking us to rethink what we mean by archive, right? I mean, he showed a video clip of an interview with a man, surviving partner, and pulling a ceramic object out of a cereal box. It was wrapped in paper and like kind of tucked under a shelf in the garage, right? And he's sort of thinking from that kind of archiving practice. So there's a very kind of binary, this sense of archives only happen in these official institutional spaces, this assumption that those spaces also suck the life out of those objects, and that this is some kind of grotesque violence, right, against the life work of it. You know, and you have people like Jack Smith, and you also have artists who make Irish exits. We never really know enough about them to ever know they existed or that their archives ever happened. And this is not in an antagonistic relationship to their life story. I just feel like there's like a kind of an absolutist language here around like archiving and value and life and death. And you know, there's also like the archive of, you know, like Justin Chin's archive, right? I mean, I meant to cite a man who just passed away quite recently, very suddenly, of a stroke, right? Totally unprepared for his own death, right? So his archive is a mess, right? Because it's like his death is a disaster. Most of our deaths will be very messy, right? Like this is actually part of the story of archives, right? And I don't know. I just feel like there's an absolutism in fact, like a looking for like the right statement about the archive. And
No, it's not an absolutism. It's not about being right or being wrong, and it's certainly not about official archives that I'm talking about. I'm talking about the activity of archiving itself, sometimes committing a violence, and I don't think there's a lot of argument that one can make with that, because archiving is often for the living and not for the dead. it's to us that we feel like, well, yes, this work must be preserved, this person's legacy must be preserved, but in fact, what lasts and what doesn't last is not necessarily up to anyone. Even if you do preserve someone's archive, it may or not be read, it may or may not have meaning to people later on. It may exceed its time or it may not. So there's a kind of agency here that I'm trying to hit back on, that I think is the heroism of the archivist who's constantly scooping up materials that would otherwise be lost to history and preserving them as if preservation is always on the side of right. And I think that memorialization itself is a deeply normative activity, and we always have to be conscious of that. I don't think that's an absolute statement.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I threw up this image of thinking with live performance about what live performance can sort of capture of deadness, or the sort of live deadness that we saw in the image this morning. The non-determinate space between live, re-live, dead, re-dead is really important to think with, and I do think that some of that resists traditional thinking about the archive. And the risk of making that argument is to become absolutist, and I think you're absolutely right. Obviously, psychoanalysis is a theory of the archive. It's a theory of thinking about how things that happen sort of that are stored in another kind of place that replay across the body in eruptive ways that then can be read. And that in a sense, but this is also the kind of idea that everything is an archive already, in a way. That there isn't any such thing as, well, if it's not put in an archive, it won't be preserved. It's actually asking us to think about preservation differently and to listen, not in our habitual idea of preservation as being so overly indebted to the object that it can't listen in other ways to those who have left. And they have left no trace. Trace in our habit of thinking of trace as object remains. So, I think it's also a real invitation to think trace otherwise. And that's all, that's all my efforts are.
So there's something that I've been thinking about throughout the day, trying to figure out how to articulate this. I'm not sure if I'm going to get it right, but it's something about this question of how we're talking about the archive as though it is an act outside of the self, and that it is a conscious activity. So I'm thinking about sort of the metabolization of experience. In us, I'm thinking about on the last panel, Jeffrey, we were talking about a performance that happened in human resources. What would it like to be gathered from life human? Right? So that's talking about the metabolization of experience, which is in itself a different kind of archive, right? So archive isn't always a conscious process. It isn't always an intentional process. So that would kind of make the sort of the reverse argument about it's always queer sex or any kind of sex as the ultimate act of sort of unconscious embodied archival experience, where we are always reorganizing in relation to each other. We always are marked by the other in some way, conscious or not. And so in that way, in relationship to the dead, there are ways to talk about responsibility, ways to talk and a lot of questions that especially all of the others who we've lost in the last 25 years. Something about also cultural context and the way in which art sometimes can and often cannot anticipate contexts which have not yet occurred. So what makes art safe or experience safe to exist at one moment and not safe to exist at another moment? The things that we don't want found in one moment, 25 years ago, what context makes them necessary?
that's really well put. I think it follows up on exactly what Rebecca was saying, which is that we're always in archives, we're always archiving with others. The concept of an archive is the collection of what remains of experience, life, interaction, is never elsewhere. It's always also here. But I think it's more the fantasy of archiving as holding on that I'm trying to connect to a certain orientation to life that the particular moment that we're in is preoccupied with. Life, longevity, extension, permanence, all of those things that maybe we also need to think ecologically in relationship to the possibility of letting go, of you know, what Martin Manlanza calls the stuff of the archive, that this stuff also needs to go, that we also need to get rid of stuff. Are we potentially hoarders? Are we thinking that we have greater capacity to store things digitally and everything else than ever before? Is there nothing we can let go of? I think that's what I'm asking, which is why I'm suggesting that Boy Child, one of the things that I experience in relationship to their performances is a kind of pedagogical exercise in letting go. And that we almost have to be taught how to give things up. And it's that I don't find that to be a polemic so much as a sort of subtle part of what you're calling this archive of experience that are created within and between and amongst queer people, and probably all kinds of people, not only queer people. Do you want to jump in?
I do. This may be somewhat tangential. I'm a librarian, and a very common question with graduate students is something to the extent of, I Googled this thing for hours, days on hand, whatever it is, and I cannot find anything about it. It could be a trace of a performance that took place 25 years ago, but there's no documentation. And I'm thinking about a thesis or whatnot, and I have to write something or research something, and the fact that most of human experience or human history is not captured anywhere, be it on the internet or in print or elsewhere, we forget that. So much of human history has not been archived, it's not part of the archive. And I keep on thinking that because of that, there is nothing to forget, because there is nothing there.
Well, I was thinking immediately, when you said that I was thinking about Avery Gordon's work, which is a sociology of haunting. And she suggests that sociology is so preoccupied with empirical, the collection of things, the saying what is, finding out what was there. And she proposes a sociology of what was not there. What if it was a history of things that didn't happen? A literature of things we did not feel. It's like the CV of papers I did not write. There are so many anti-archival gestures and impulses that we have that I think, no, on the one hand, we don't want to just say it's either the archive or the anti-archive, but we do need to recognize all the anti-archival impulses that collect even around our most archival moments. So that if we wanted to really go with Jennifer's proposal, then we have to be willing, as you're saying, to grapple with the fact, the pure fact, that most of what we call human history has not left a trace, right? And part of the violence of our era is that we are constantly leaving traces. We're leaving traces that are ruinous in some way.
There's the other side of it, which is that everything has left a trace, just not left it in the art, in the library, and that actually you can access it. I had this once with one of the first papers I wrote was on a Spider-Woman theater company, and had to end up citing a ghost because I had a huge Spider-Woman says, oh yeah, or people have that all the time, but you won't find it in an archive. Do you just not cite it? Do you just not allow another kind of visitation, for instance, or questions of, can you have a memory that wasn't yours? Can memories jump? Do experiences jump body to body? And if they do, then you could maybe recover or be the host to something that, as far as is lost, but may have another resonance. So that's something I'm interested in, but yeah. but I love libraries.
I mean, the fact is, as you say, Jeff, we're in it all the time. But when you curate, you have to know that Castles displays objects and photographs are quite beautiful. And so I'm just not reconciling the fact that actually speaking, if we didn't have some aspect to these remains. So, which isn't a value judgment, it's just a fact that, you know, I love what both of you said up to a point, but I think it's not.
That's because we're in a certain system. I mean, I think, you know, what I learned from writing that intro to the Undercommons is that it's not enough to just rearrange the pieces that are in the system. You actually have to shift the system itself. It's like you can't see certain ways, and we can't be in different relation to art because we're in the system that sees art that way as collectible or as a thing that must leave or remain. So there has to be, can we imagine different relationships to artwork that aren't always about valuation and this, the valuation of this over that.
I think that's what Eric Ball was talking about this morning. Sorry, I feel like that talk has been forgotten, right? Like, there was, you know, wonderful conversation this morning about an entire, like, career, like, that's the right word, practice, lifelong practice. I think you're still here. That was very much like, I don't know, articulated in exactly those terms. And I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think it was an important part of the day. And I just want to kind of like remember, you know, that we began with a conversation about a set of art practices that absolutely happened outside of institutional spaces. And it's not just like an anti-institutional space. There's, you know, it's not just about like,
Who's talking about You just remembered that as orature. Now, orature was given to not remain in art, but there's a history to saying who has history and who doesn't. And those that have performance modes of history that is past body to body transmission without an object in the archive, and that says, I'm going to perform it, but I'm going to riff it, and I'm going to remember you by performing my riff. It'll be different from yours, but it's my mode of remembering you. It is not about identicality or sameness given through transmission in an archive. It's a jump. It's a jump of difference. So the radical thing, the sort of completely unacceptable thing for artists, and I think maybe unacceptable thing, and it's fine with me, is that Castle's piece might be that amazing clay sculpture made castles in the piece, and that I, in my entry to the sculpture, am made in another way relative to it. That the meaning of the piece bounces into the intervals of its encounter, and maybe there's another way of remembering that, and another way of saving, although not into saving, but you know. So it is, yeah. It is asking for something out of step of that, but I don't think it's destruction of an artist's work. I think it's asking for another way of recalling, like you just did.
But I don't sell that sculpture. That sculpture is now going to have its own life as sites where acts of violence against gender non-conforming occurred as a public monument. You know, so I'm not just making this ephemeral of clay or then we're going to cast it and sell it in the gallery. That's I just wanted to clarify. No, I stopped process when you said I just wanted to make sure people know that that's not the case.
Okay,
It goes out and has another life. Yes. And it doesn't exist in the art market or not in the art market. It actually exists. There are other places.
I think that's what Rebecca's
Yeah,
saying.
exactly.
There are so many of these in-between spaces that we barely name or acknowledge. That's exactly a good example. So. All right, well, apparently people got mad, so thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.